What if I told you this story begins with a woman standing in the ruins of her life, offering marriage to a stranger, not for love, but for survival, that what followed wasn't romance, but something fiercer. Truth, lost blood, and a legacy carved into the windswept hills of Red Ridge. This isn't just a tale of love. It's a battle cry for the broken, a prayer for the strong, and a lesson for all of us on what it truly means to stay when everything else runs. Stay with us. You need to hear how this ends. The sky above Red Ridge never warned with subtlety. That evening it wore the hue of dried blood, bruised and waiting. Clouds hung low and heavy as if the mountain itself had exhaled sorrow. Winds screamed through the canyon, echoing like an old hymn no one wanted to hear. In this kind of weather, folks bolted doors and whispered prayers, but Silas Boone hadn't prayed in a long time. He stood alone outside his collapsing barn hat and hand coat, flapping in defiance of both wind and hope. The barn behind him groaned with age and neglect. The roof had caved on one side. Rusted tools lay scattered where his brother had last thrown them in anger a year ago. Chickens scratched in dry dirt, oblivious to the storm gathering. Silas didn't move. Not when the wind picked up, not when the last of the light drained from the sky. He had nothing left worth rushing for. His ranch had been sold out from under him by a banker with too many teeth and no soul. His brother had gone chasing gold in Arizona and never came back. His horse died the same day the sheriff posted the foreclosure. Some men break loud. Silas broke quiet, and when he shattered, no one noticed. So when the woman appeared, coat-snapping boots, stomping thunder, chasing her heels, he almost believed she was a ghost. Rowena Graves didn't knock. She didn't speak her name. She walked straight into his life like it was hers to claim. "I need a husband," she said. That was her hello. Silas blinked. The shovel in his hand clanked against the floor. "Excuse me." She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "You're broke. Beaten. Bone lonely," she said. "I've got land heat quiet and a roof that doesn't leak yet. I need a man who'll work, who won't ask for more than food and a bed and maybe a reason to keep standing." She pulled a paper from her coat and handed it to him. The wind tried to snatch it. He caught it out of reflex. The folds were sharp, ink bold, marriage contract. No kissing hands, no lies in the dark. Just labor and silence. "If you stay long enough, maybe we raise something stronger than both of us. Maybe we teach her how to fight, not cry." Silas stared down at the contract. His hands shook. Not from cold, from remembering how it felt to be offered something instead of blamed for everything. "Why me?" he asked. Rowena glanced at him like she was looking at the last tree in a dying orchard. "Because you didn't run, and I need someone who won't." Then, without waiting, she turned and walked away. She left behind the sharp scent of wood smoke and damp leather. Silas stood rooted in place, the paper still in his hand. The barn creaked again, as if to remind him the past had already buried itself here. That night, he didn't light a lamp. Just sat with the paper on his lap, heart thudding like hooves in dry dirt. He read the words 3 times. They didn't change. There was no romance, no salvation. But there was purpose. By morning, the wind had gone still. Sky, pale and tired. Silas put on his cleanest shirt, mended boots, and strapped his father's knife to his belt. Not because he feared Rowena, but because you don't walk unarmed into a life this wild. Rowena's ranch sat 5 miles west, perched on a ridge like it had clawed its way out of the mountain. The chimney puffed steady smoke. The house itself was wide-shouldered, stone-walled, built to survive things softer places couldn't. He arrived, not knowing if he'd be met with a rifle or a cup of coffee. She was waiting on the porch, arms crossed. A dog lay by her feet. It didn't bark. It didn't have to. "You sign it?" she asked. He held up the paper. "Yeah?" She didn't smile, didn't even nod. "You still want to die?" she asked. Silas took a breath. That question cut deeper than a blade. "No," he said quietly. Rowena stepped aside. "Then come in." He passed her in silence, boots thudding against the wooden floor. Inside smelled of cedar and cooked onions. A rifle hung on the wall. A kettle hissed on the stove. She shut the door behind him. It clicked like a final chapter closing. Silas stood in the center of the room, hands still trembling, not from fear, but from the sudden shocking weight of being chosen. She poured him a cup of coffee, black as sin and just as strong. "Sit," she said. He did. Neither spoke for a long time. Outside, the wind quieted to a low hum. The fire popped softly in the hearth. In that silence, something began to take root. Not love, not yet, but a seed of something neither of them had dared hope for in years. She finally broke the quiet. "You can take the back room. I don't want snoring near my head." "Fair enough," he said. "You work hard, I work quiet. That'll do." She got up, walked toward the hallway, then paused. "I'll expect you up by dawn. The barn roof's got a lean worse than yours." Silas gave a soft, dry chuckle. "Then I'll fix it first." She disappeared down the hall without another word. Silas sat for a long while after she left, listening to the fire, watching the shadows shift. Somewhere outside, a coyote howled. He didn't flinch. He felt something rising in his chest, slow, unfamiliar, heavy. Not fear, not even hope. Maybe it was the start of belonging. Maybe it was the first breath of a new beginning. He finished his coffee, stood, and walked toward the back room. Whatever tomorrow brought, he'd meet it standing, and that after all this time was something. The mornings came colder than Silas expected. Not the kind of cold that bit skin or froze breath, but the kind that crept under bones, reminding you that even the earth could feel empty sometimes. At Rowena's ranch, the day didn't begin with roosters or sunshine. It began with silence and work. On his first morning, Rowena handed him a hammer and pointed to the sagging barn roof. No instructions, no pleasantries. Just the expectation that he'd figure it out or fall trying. By mid-morning, his palms were already torn, blistered along old scars. But he didn't stop. Because if she could swing an axe with such precision it sang through air, then he sure as hell could learn to match her pace. They didn't talk much. Not that first week. But every nail driven and board lifted was its own kind of conversation. The kind spoken through aching backs and breath in the cold. They built fences without asking for help, lifted timber side by side. She moved like a soldier, and he moved like a man trying to remember how. They worked as if they'd always known the land had no room for those who softened too easily. Rowena cooked simple meals, beans, cornbread, rabbit stew, and always set 2 plates. She never waited for thanks. Silas never offered one. But he always cleaned his plate, and she always poured him 1 more cup of coffee before standing to scrub the dishes. The house was built with thick stone walls and quiet. At night, they each retreated to separate rooms. He could hear her moving through the hall's steady steps, door hinges that refused to creak, windows latched before the wind could find a way in. It wasn't loneliness between them. It was a kind of waiting, like 2 animals testing whether the other would bite or sit beside the fire. On the 8th day, the well froze. Rowena grabbed 2 buckets and didn't say a word. Silas followed. The water was buried deep and the pump needed repair. She handed him a wrench. He knelt beside the metal breath, fogging the air, and asked, "You ever fixed this before?" She shrugged. "Not yet." They worked until their fingers were numb, until the pump coughed up bitter cold water that splashed their boots. When it finally flowed, she didn't smile, just looked at him and said, "Good. Tomorrow the south fence." But something had shifted. That night she left a spare blanket folded at the end of his bed. The days grew harder before they grew easier. Fixing the wagon wheel meant wrestling iron that fought back. Gathering firewood meant dragging fallen limbs through knee-high snow. She taught him how to identify dry pine by scent, how to sharpen a blade with only stone and instinct. He showed her how to oil hinges so they didn't squeak, how to build a chimney draft that wouldn't smoke the whole house. One day, she cut her hand, deep enough to bleed through her glove. She didn't flinch, but Silas dropped what he was doing and rushed to her side. She tried to brush it off, but he took her hand gently and cleaned it with a cloth soaked in warm water. Neither of them spoke during the process, but her eyes held his longer than they ever had before. Later that night, she sat beside him on the porch the first time she'd done so. She brought out a small tin of tobacco, rolled herself a cigarette, and lit it with a match from the hearth. They sat in silence, staring at the stars, an expanse so wide it could swallow regret. "You miss it?" she asked suddenly. "Miss what?" Whatever came before this. He thought for a long moment. "No," he said. "I miss who I thought I was in it." She nodded, took a drag, and let it go slow. "That man wouldn't have lasted out here." "Maybe not," he said. "But I think this one might." She didn't reply, but when she stood, she said, "Leave the porch light burning. I like it when I come back from the barn." It was the closest thing to softness he'd heard in her voice. By the third week, they moved like pieces of the same clock. She handed him tools before he asked. He placed the coffee on the table exactly how she liked it, no sugar, just hot. He even started leaving small notes beside her plate. Not poems, not declarations, just things like Ruth's holding. "Your axe is sharper than mine. Thanks for the stew." She never mentioned them aloud, but she kept everyone. One evening, a storm came fast, the kind that twisted trees and rattled windows. Silas ran to secure the shutters, but the north gate had blown open. He sprinted into the rain, fighting the wind, and by the time he got it closed, he was soaked through. When he came inside, Rowena was already waiting with a towel. "You didn't have to," he started. She cut him off. "You did, I do." He looked at her hair-damp eyes, darker than the storm outside. "Are we still pretending we're just surviving?" She said nothing. But she didn't hand him a blanket that night. She let the fire burn longer. And when he rose the next morning, the extra cup of coffee was already waiting. The work hadn't lessened. But now it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like carving out something honest, something earned. Silas never asked Rowena about the man she'd lost, and she never asked about the family he'd buried. But the ghosts stopped whispering as loud when they were together. They built not just a life, but a rhythm, nail by nail, blister by blister. And in the quiet hours between sweat and sleep, a truth settled in the air around them. Some people are not rescued by love, they're rebuilt by it. It was a Tuesday when the past came calling. Not the kind of Tuesday you forget clear skies that held no warning birds that sang too loud and wind that carried no scent of rain. Trouble doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes on horseback under a sunlit sky. Silas was mending the fence on the South Ridge shirt, damp with sweat hands, blistered but steady. He'd just hammered the final nail when the dog barked a sharp foreign bark that told him this wasn't a deer or a fox. It was someone who didn't belong. He turned to see dust rising from the trail. 4 riders, one ahead of the others, dressed in black, riding a horse the color of coal. And that rider Silas knew before the face came into focus. Some names linger longer than their owners. Reynard Bishop wasn't a man you forgot. He hadn't seen Reynard since the funeral of Rowena's husband, a man Reynard claimed as cousin, though the resemblance ended at cruelty. Reynard had eyes like nails, small, sharp, and full of intent. Trouble came with him, like a shadow. Rowena met them on the porch, rifle slung over her shoulder like a warning, dressed in wood and steel. "Didn't expect to see you again," she said. Reynard tipped his hat-fall smile wide. "You know me, Ro, I like unfinished business." Silas walked up from behind the barn, calm, slow. The kind of slow that said he wasn't looking for trouble, but wouldn't duck it either. He stopped beside Rowena, arms crossed, eyes fixed. Reynard noticed. "And you must be the new pet," he said, sneering. Silas didn't answer. Rowena did. "This is Silas Boone. He signs his name with sweat, not threats. You could learn something from him." Reynard laughed. His men chuckled too. But there was an edge to it. They weren't laughing because it was funny. They were laughing because they didn't know what else to do. Reynard stepped closer. "I heard you married again, Ro. Quick even for you. Makes folks wonder what you're really after." "I'm after peace," she said. "Something you've never had the spine for." Reynard's smile cracked just a little. "This land belonged to my cousin. Blood rights don't disappear just 'cause you found a new man. It belonged to me before it belonged to him. And it'll belong to my daughter long after you're bones and dust." Silas stepped forward. "Just one step, just enough." "You should leave now," he said. Voice calm, low, unmoving. Reynard's eyes met his. "You think you scare me?" Silas didn't blink. "No, but I think I'm the reason you're still standing, so don't push it." Reynard stared for a long second, then scoffed. "This ain't over." He turned his horse and rode out. His men followed slower. One of them, young, maybe too young, looked back with something like fear in his eyes. That night the house felt different, quieter than usual. Rowena poured tea instead of coffee, sat by the fire but didn't pick up her book. Silas sat across from her, hands still dirty from work, chest still tight from holding back what he'd wanted to do. "You knew he'd come," he said. She nodded. "He's not done," Silas added. "No, he never is." She looked at him, then really looked. "You meant what you said about him standing because you let him." Silas didn't hesitate. "I don't say things I don't mean." She didn't respond right away. Then she stood, walked past him, and paused at the hallway. "Come with me." He followed without question. She opened the door to her bedroom and stepped aside. There was no grand gesture, no romance, just the quiet of two people who understood the difference between want and need. That night, for the first time, Silas Boone didn't sleep on the floor. The morning after was colder, not in temperature but in stillness. Rowena rose early, started the fire, didn't speak of the night before. But when Silas came into the kitchen, she placed a cup of coffee beside his plate. And in the center of the table a folded cloth with his name stitched in the corner. It wasn't a love note, it was a belonging. Over the next week they prepared, not with panic but with precision. Silas sharpened tools, reinforced doors, moved firewood closer to the house. Rowena checked the rifle sights, cleaned the lanterns, oiled the hinges. They didn't talk about Reynard, but he was in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Then, one morning, a note was found, nailed to the barn. "You took what ain't yours." Rowena burned it in silence. Silas watched the flames. Later that night he sat on the porch, sharpening his knife. The stars overhead were indifferent. The wind had no warning. But Silas Boone knew this kind of calm. The kind that came before something broke. He looked at the door behind him, then at the fields beyond. And he whispered not to the wind, but to the memory of the man he used to be, "Come, if you must. But I won't run, not this time." He stayed there a while longer, the cold creeping through the planks of the porch, wrapping around his boots, crawling up through his coat. But he didn't move, because somewhere out there trouble was saddling up again. and this time it wouldn't be content to just make threats. Inside, Rowena watched him from the window. Her hand rested on the edge of the table, fingertips tapping slow and steady. She had seen men like Reynard before, men who believed power came from taking, not building. But Reynard had never built anything with his own 2 hands, not a home, not a family, not even peace. She stepped out onto the porch and stood beside Silas. "You think he'll come back with more?" Silas nodded. "Then we'll meet him like this," she said. Standing together, they didn't touch. But the space between them disappeared just the same. The wind didn't howl that night, it whispered. It crept through the seams of the old stone house like a secret begging to be heard. Rowena was sitting at the edge of the bed, pale and drenched in sweat, her hand pressed hard against her lower belly. The pain had started hours ago, dull at first, but now it came in waves that robbed the air from her lungs. Silas woke to her silence, and that alone told him something was wrong. She didn't want to cry out, didn't want to wake him. That wasn't her way. But when he knelt beside the bed and saw the look in her eyes, the world shifted. "I think it's time," she whispered, barely audible. No doctor, no midwife, no help for miles. Only the man she'd let into her house and the storm gathering outside. Silas moved fast. He lit lamps, boiled water, laid out towels with trembling hands. He wasn't prepared. No man ever is. But he'd once sworn he wouldn't leave, not when it mattered. Rowena bit down on a strip of leather as the pain gripped her like fire. She didn't scream. She didn't wail. She bore it like she bore everything else. Head up, fists clenched, silent and defiant. The hours crawled. The storm outside roared louder, matching the violence within her body. Silas stayed with her through all of it, letting her crush his hands, soaking sweat and blood into his shirt, whispering words he never thought he'd say aloud. "You're doing it. You're strong. You're not alone." And then, at 3:14 a.m., under the flickering lantern light and the wrath of the wind, a cry pierced the night. A baby girl, tiny, fierce, loud, her face red with protest, her fists clenched like she already knew the world would try to tame her. Rowena wept, finally. Not from pain, but from a tidal wave of something she hadn't let herself feel in years. "You came," she whispered into her daughter's dark hair. "You came anyway." They named her Nova, for the light that bursts into being even after everything else has burned. Life changed instantly. Not easier, never easier, but something shifted. The house wasn't quieter, it was fuller. The chores still needed doing, the fences still needed mending. But now each task held more weight, more purpose. Rowena wore her motherhood like she wore her coat firmly, without apology, and Silas walked beside her like a shield. When the townsfolk caught wind of the baby, the rumors returned. The whispers. "Too old," they said. "Not his," they muttered. "She married him for safety. Look what she's gotten herself into now." But Rowena didn't flinch, and Silas didn't let her walk alone. One afternoon, Mrs. Talbert at the general store made a comment too sharp to ignore. "A miracle baby born in the mud. Huh, what a story." Silas didn't raise his voice. He simply set a sack of potatoes gently on the counter and said, "Say something like that again, and I'll forget I ever learned to be gentle." The store went silent. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Rowena didn't thank him. She just reached out and hooked her pinky through his as they walked home. "You're good at that," she said. But the peace didn't last. Reynard came back. This time in the dead of night with fire and fury. 3 men rode with him, drunk, angry, hungry, for land that wasn't theirs. They didn't knock. They lit the east fence, waiting for the smoke to wake them. Silas saw it first. He yelled for Rowena to stay inside. But she never had been the type to listen. She burst out the front door with a rifle slung over her shoulder, nightgown soaked from the pump, her eyes blazing brighter than the flames. "I told you," she shouted into the smoke, "this land is mine." Reynard stepped forward, laughing. "That baby yours. Row, or is it this fool's doesn't matter? Neither of you'll see winter." That's when Silas walked into the firelight. Barefoot, shirtless, blood on his knuckles from smashing a window to reach the hose. "I'm done playing humble," he said. Rowena tossed him the rifle. He caught it one-handed. What followed wasn't a shootout, it was a reckoning. Silas didn't fire first. He waited. Calm, steady, terrifying. When the first man raised his pistol, Silas shot him in the leg. The second he hit in the shoulder. The third dropped his gun before he could raise it. Reynard stood alone, eyes wild, hands shaking. "Go," Silas said. "Bring fire again, and you won't limp home next time." Reynard looked like he might argue. Then Rowena stepped up beside Silas, another rifle in hand barrel tilted just enough. Reynard didn't ride away, he walked. Inside, Rowena trembled. Not from fear, but from the weight of all she had protected. Silas wrapped a towel around her shoulders, poured her water, whispered, "It's done." She looked at him like he'd grown taller overnight. "You could have killed him. If he'd touched you, I would have," Silas said. And Rowena, fierce Rowena, whispered something she never thought she would. "I'm scared of him." "No," she said, "of how much I love you." He didn't answer, just leaned in, kissed her forehead like a promise, and she whispered back, "Marry me again." He smiled. "You already did. Do it right. I'll even get a ring." They married again that fall. No preacher, no guests. Just the two of them barefoot in the back pasture, standing in a circle of wild sunflowers Rowena had grown from her mother's seeds. Silas slipped a silver ring onto her finger. His mother's. Rowena's hands shook as she placed her grandfather's onto his. "With this ring," he said, "I promise to stay, to fight, to raise whatever comes our way, even if the world don't understand it." And she answered, "With this ring, I promise never to shrink, so you can feel tall, and never to let you fall alone." They kissed once, and it was more than any paper prayer or parade could have given them. They built a gate that sprang the kind with thick beams and a name carved into the arch Callahan Ridge. Beneath it in letters Rowena had etched by hand it read, "Home of Nova, born of fire, raised by storm." It wasn't just decoration, it was a declaration, a warning, a prayer. Nova grew fast, too fast. Before she was 2, she could mimic the call of a mourning dove and name the tools hanging in the shed. By 4, she was riding bareback on the gentlest mare, her small fists tangled in the mane, laughing at the wind. She didn't cry easily. When she fell, she stood. When she was angry, she went silent. That silence wasn't empty, it was watching, measuring. By the time she was 10, Nova could outshoot most of the town's boys, and she never apologized for being better. Folks whispered again, said she was wild, said she was strange, said she should smile more, wear dresses, play with dolls. But at home she built birdhouses with Silas and learned how to repair wagon wheels. Rowena taught her how to hunt, how to track, how to listen to the forest. And every night as they tucked her in, Rowena whispered the same thing: "The world fears girls who don't flinch." Nova would whisper back, "Then I won't flinch." When she turned 13, she asked Silas why Rowena had picked him. He looked at her for a long moment and said, "Because I didn't run. Did you ever want to? Every day at first, but I stayed for her, then for you." Nova nodded, like she already understood that love wasn't always soft. It was often a kind of standing still in the middle of a storm. But even love couldn't stop time. Rowena passed quietly in the chair where she once rocked Nova to sleep. No pain, no warning, just sunlight through the window and a book on her lap. Silas found her, touched her hand, and whispered, "I'm still here." He buried her under the sunflowers she had once planted. There was no preacher, no sermon, just him and Nova standing side by side as wind stirred the petals like prayer. The marker read, "Rowena Graves Boone." The storm they couldn't break. Nova didn't speak for days. When she finally did, she asked if they were still a family. "Always," Silas said. On her 18th birthday, Nova told Silas she was leaving, to learn, to teach, to fight better. He didn't try to stop her, just helped her pack and strapped his old knife to her belt. "You come back when you're ready," he said. "I will," she promised. Then she turned to him and said, "I love you, Daddy." He hugged her tight. "I never needed a strong daughter," he whispered, "but God, I'm glad I got one." As she rode away, dust rising behind her, Silas stood under the gate, his hand resting on the carved wood. The wind carried the faintest echo of Rowena's voice. "Raise her not to flinch." And Silas whispered back, "We did." Time moved on, but the house didn't fall silent. Silas kept tending the land one chore at a time. He fixed the barn door that always stuck, mended the fences Nova used to climb, and every Sunday he walked to the ridge with a book and read aloud like Rowena used to. He read to the wind, to the sunflowers, to the memories that refused to fade. Sometimes neighbors dropped by, curious if he'd sell now that he was alone. Silas always smiled the same way. Alone, who said I was alone. One winter evening, a letter came, postmarked from Missouri. Inside, Nova's handwriting stretched across the page like wind through wheat fields. She was teaching now young girls older than she'd been when she learned to hold a rifle. She wrote of a girl who reminded her of herself, quiet and angry. She said she told the girl, "You don't have to be soft to be good." Silas wrote back, "Don't let the world tell her to be smaller. Make sure she hears the truth loud enough to grow." Seasons passed, the house aged. So did Silas, but he stayed sharp. He kept journals filled with memories for Nova, for whoever would need them. He wrote about the first time Rowena touched his hand, about the fire, about the way Nova stood with her feet planted like she belonged to the earth itself. And then one day, just as spring broke the frost, a rider appeared on the horizon. Silas didn't need to squint. He knew the shape of her shoulders, the way she leaned forward in the saddle. Nova. She rode slower now, but her eyes were just as steady. Her voice when she dismounted and said, "Hey, Daddy," still held the thunder of her mother. They didn't hug at first, just stood, measured, smiled. Then she opened her bag and pulled out a book. "For the ridge," she said. "It's full of lessons I borrowed from you and Ma." Silas took the book in his calloused hands. "Then let's make a shelf that'll hold it." And together in the shadow of the gate Rowena built, they worked. Some stories don't end with the last ride or the last word. They echo in the creak of a gate, in the scent of sunflowers on the wind, in the quiet strength passed from one generation to the next. The story of Rowena, Silas, and Nova Boone wasn't just a tale of survival on the rugged plains of Red Ridge. It was a story of choosing each other when life offered nothing but ashes. Of building love without words. Of teaching a child not to shrink to fit the world, but to rise tall enough to change it. It started with a woman who didn't believe in sweetness, who had lost too much to dream softly. Rowena Graves needed a husband not for romance, but for a second chance at forging something real. She found Silas Boone not because he was strong, not because he was charming, but because he didn't run. And together in silence and sweat they built a home on scorched land. Their love wasn't declared under stars or written in letters. It was found in calloused hands brushing against each other during chores, in unspoken glances passed over dinner and standing side by side when danger knocked on their door. They carved a life out of hardship, and when their daughter Nova was born, she became the storm's answer to everything they'd lost. Nova wasn't raised in ease. She was raised in windfire and truth. She learned to ride before she could read shoot straighter than most men before she turned 10, and never bowed her head to anyone who told her to be less. She bore her mother's fire and her father's steadiness, and that combination was no accident. It was legacy by design. When Rowena died, she left behind no will, no fortune, only a path, a memory, a gate with her daughter's name carved into it. Silas didn't crumble under the loss. He didn't drown in sorrow. He remembered. He continued, because that's what love like theirs required. Not mourning, but movement. Not forgetting, but carrying forward. And when Nova left, as all children must, she carried them with her not just in blood, but in bone, in belief. She went into the world not just to live, but to teach, to fight for others, like her girls told they were too loud, too rough, too much. She became the answer to a question the world hadn't known how to ask. She didn't seek permission. She carried her mother's rifle and her father's calm, and everywhere she went she planted seeds like Rowena once did, only now they took root in hearts. Silas remained at the ridge. He aged like the land weathered, proud and alive, in a way most men never get to be. He spent his evenings writing letters to Nova, most of them never sent. Letters full of advice, memories, even recipes. He kept the journals tucked under the floorboards beside Rowena's old boots. He would read them out loud to the wind some nights, just in case. Over the years, the town changed. Faces came and went. But people still pointed to Callahan Ridge and whispered. About the woman who dared too much, the man who stood his ground, the girl who was forged like iron. And the story never stopped growing. That's what makes their story so powerful. It didn't rely on miracles. It didn't ask for pity. It simply showed what it looks like to love through labor, to hold the line when the wind howls, and to raise something greater than yourself. In a time when so much seems fleeting, when connections are temporary and promises cheap, their story reminds us of the kind of roots that hold fast. You don't need to live on a ranch to understand it. You don't need to swing an axe or birth a child in a snowstorm. What you need is to remember that your strength matters, that showing up counts, that kindness can be fierce, and that silence can be louder than shouting when it carries the weight of love. So maybe you've lost something. Maybe you've been running, or maybe you've just been surviving. Take heart from Rowena, from Silas, from Nova. Know that you can rebuild. Know that even broken people can build something unbreakable. That you don't have to be gentle to be good, but you do have to be honest. And if this story moved you even just a little, if it reminded you of someone you love, or someone you've lost, or someone you're still fighting for, then don't let it stay silent. Share it. Carry it. Pass it on like a torch. And please, if you'd like to see more stories like this, stories that honor, grit, love, sacrifice, and quiet courage, subscribe to the channel. Turn on that little bell so you don't miss the next tale. Every story we share is built like this one, with care, with truth, and with the hope that somewhere it helps someone remember they are not alone. Thank you for riding with us.